Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again with another video. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about how many times have you heard the phrase sharpen like a pro. I've heard this before, but it's interesting because, what is a pro? An arborist normally cuts down trees, and that's what he's got to be a professional at, especially for danger and everything else. But just because he cuts down trees doesn't mean he's a professional at sharpening his chain. After a hard day's work, I don't think he wants to go home and sharpen chains. He's probably got someone that he drops them off to and sharpens them up for him. I know that if I was doing a job charging thousands of dollars to drop down a large tree, the last thing I'd want to do when I get home is spend time sharpening up bloody chainsaw chains. So yeah, I would imagine, unless he's got lots of time on his hands, I'm imagining that he's either dropping them off at the shop or he's got someone sharpening up for him. Because I know a few arborists that don't sharpen their own chains, and that sort of says, "Oh shit, I ain't got enough time to do that, mate. It's bad enough during the day. I'm flat out, let alone getting home and taking my work with me." So that leaves, if you do drop them off at the shop, your local chainsaw shop, I've heard a lot of bad reports there where they grind way too much off them, wrong angles, don't adjust the rakers. So this so-called cliche, sharpen like a pro, I think that's, it's not exactly true and correct. So you, the homeowner, can sharpen like a professional, because if you take the time and learn how to do it, you can do a professional job, if not better than the factory. All you've got to do is learn a few basic tips. The angle of the top plate. So when we talk about that, if you hold a file perpendicular to the chainsaw bar and tilt it 30 degrees that way, and you file 30 degrees, approximately 30 degrees. I don't want to talk about 25 degrees and 35 degrees. 30 degrees is the most popular worldwide. It'll get you out of trouble in softwood and hardwood. I've actually got it marked on here. You can see on here that I've got 30 degrees, 25, then 30, then 25 again. See? So I've got this, and what I can do is just bring this up to the line, and I can focus doing it that way, right? And be 100% sure that I'm filing at 30 degrees. The other thing to be careful of is that you're holding your file above the top of the tooth, between 20 and 25% of the diameter of the file, and make sure you're using the right file. So for this 3/8 chain, I'm using 5.2 millimeters, but when the chain's brand new and the tooth's a lot longer, I use 5.5. There is absolutely nothing wrong with using a file guide. These are from Stihl, and you can get them in Oregon, and other manufacturers make them. Husqvarna, I think, got their own. And as you can see, Stihl only use 30 degrees for their semi-chisel RS chains. Hexa uses a different filing system. And if you're doing rip-in chains, they use 10 degrees, which is down here. So the way that these work is it holds the file at the correct height. And if you line up that line with the bar, you can't go wrong. You see, you'll be filing at the correct angle. These are actually great to make sure. Look, I'd highly recommend these if you're thinking of doing a lot of filing. These are highly recommended because they ensure that they're holding the file at the correct level. You can go back to using this file, but it's a great idea to use the file holder every now and then on the chain, just to make sure that it's within the specification that it should be. It's the quickest way to bring your chain back to factory specs. A simple file holder, all as it has is a screw on the bottom and it locks in under there, and that's roughly a 10-degree angle. If you want 10 degrees downward tilt, you can tilt it down a little bit. A little bit of tilt will never hurt. So you as a homeowner can certainly file like a professional with a little bit of training and a little bit of taking your time, and train yourself to use the tools properly, and you'll file like a professional person in no time at all. But yeah, please make sure that you get one of these, because it will always ensure that you get back on track. Another thing about files, avoid buying the real El Cheapo files out there. Use the either Still files or Velobe, the Swiss ones. They don't last long at all. You're lucky if you're going to get 4 or 5 chains, 20-inch chains, out of a file, and then it will start to go blunt. And another practice or another mistake that people make with a file is that when they're filing, right, sometimes they tend to get off angle as they push it through or go too much like that. So you must learn to keep that file parallel with the tooth to create a nice straight edge. And as I said, practice makes perfect. So don't be afraid to do that. Now, the other thing is, I've made this up. This is just a piece of angle iron attached to like a bit of a bar type mechanism. You can still actually sell a plastic magnetic plastic card with magnets on it that you put on the side of your bar, and it has these crisscrosses for 35 and 25 degrees, so that when filing you can see that you're at the right angle. But again, one of these is always going to ensure that you are filing at the right angle. So do yourself a favour and do that. Now, the next thing, if we talk about Sharpen like a pro, is using a chainsaw grinder. Okay, so I don't want to spend a half an hour talking about a grinder and how to use it, because if you've got one, maybe I can give you a few tips. The top plate angle, right? This is where we adjust the top plate angle here. In most cases, like the file, you're going to set this 30 degrees to the left and 30 degrees to the right. This is going to get you out of trouble in most situations, unless you're doing hexa, which is 25 degrees, or unless you're doing rip and chains, which is 10 degrees. So in most cases, 30 degrees. The adjustable head. Another word for that is top plate cutting angle. This is normally set, if you've got a still chain, still like to use 50 degrees angle on this, right? Oregon like to use about 60. So 50 is obviously more aggressive. I find out that 50 degrees works better for me than 60. It's more aggressive. I like full chisel chains rather than semi-chisel because they're more aggressive. The settings for semi-chisel and full chisel are no different. 30 degrees here, 50 degrees on here if you got still, and if you got Oregon and Carlton, they recommend maybe 60 degrees. But anyway, I like the 50 degrees because it's more aggressive and it's very durable too. The only other thing that I'd say about a grinder is make sure that you dress the wheel. It has a radius on it, which is about a half a circle. So that's what the wheel should look like when it's dressed, a half a circle. They're the different sizes there, all right? File sizes here as well. So this card's got a few bits of information all on it, different sizes there. So it usually comes with a grinder, so you can dress your wheel with a little stone that normally comes with them. These stones aren't that good. They grind away so easily. I typically use silicon carbide. Silicon carbide by Norton. That's a general purpose dressing stick. And as I say, it's silicon carbide, so it really does work better than these El Cheapo little stones, which I believe are made out of aluminium oxide, which is the same material as the wheel. So yeah, make sure that you get yourself a good dressing block like the Norton, and you'll have no problems. Now, it's up to you whether you want to use 10 degrees downward tilt, loosening this. For a right hand tooth, you'll push it away from you. There's a little jingle. If you're doing a right-hand tooth, it means right away. So right-hand tooth, push it away. Left-hand tooth, pull it towards you. That's pretty straightforward and simple. The other mistake people can make is adjusting the depth too deep. You don't want to go any deeper than the fold. And what I mean by the fold is that when you look at a tooth, you can see where it folds. It's got a bit of a fold right down to the bottom. So right down the bottom of the fold is the deepest that you'll ever go. The next thing is we'll talk about when you use the grinder is when you set the backstop up and you put a chain in there. We'll just grab a chain and pop it in there. You pop your chain in, you adjust to your 30 degrees, lock it in a position. Now, when you bring your grinding wheel down, right, and you adjust your backstop so that the tooth just touches the wheel, right? That's your starting position. So when we bring this down, it's just touching the tooth. Can you hear that touching the tooth? Make sure that it's not going, remember I said before, make sure that you adjust the depth and don't have it too deep. So make sure that it's just touching the tooth, and you'll find out that it doesn't take too much metal off. You don't need to take a lot of metal off if the chain is slightly dull. If the chain is damaged, that's a different story. So for general sharpening, that's all you're doing. You're just sharpening the chain up. If it's not damaged, you'd be lucky if you're taking 0.1 or 0.2 of a mil off. You don't really need to be taking any more metal than that amount. So just be aware of that. Now, the other mistake people make is that when they finish grinding, say the left side, they move this all around to the right side and start grinding the right side. That is a mistake because you could be taking too much metal off the right side because you haven't checked with your backstop. So again, do the same procedure, bring your grinding wheel down, make sure that you adjust your backstop so that the tooth is just touching the wheel. If it doesn't take enough metal off, that's okay. Just adjust it a little bit more so that it takes enough metal off the top plate and the side plate. It should be nice and clean and it should be ground away. You should not be taking too much metal off. Another mistake that people make is they're constantly playing around with the angles. And if you constantly play around, say 25 degrees, 30 degrees, 35 degrees, 50 degrees, 55, 60, if you keep swapping and changing angles, every time that you've got a new angle, you're going to have to grind at least a 0.5 millimetre extra off that tooth before the new profile takes shape. So my advice is avoid playing around with angles. You can do it, but it will come at a cost, and that cost will be that your chain will wear out much quicker because you're grinding it away because all the different angles that you're playing around with. As I said before, 30 degrees on here, on the top plate, will get you out of trouble in almost every single situation. 50 degrees on here if you've got steel. If you've got other chains like Oregon, they like to recommend 60 degrees. 50 degrees is more aggressive. So yes, you the homeowner can grind like a professional. You can be a professional grinder, sharpening, using your grinder. Only one of the mistakes that people make when using a grinder, they become a little bit heavy-handed on the use of pulling the grinding wheel down. When you bring the grinding wheel down, do it ever so slowly and gentle and lift it off, on, off, on. By lifting it off and on, a tapping motion, it is slowly grinding the tooth and you avoid overheating the tooth. Now, every time when I grind, sharpen my teeth, I can put my finger on it straight away after. That means that I'm going slow enough that I don't overheat the tooth. There's a lot of people get in there and start to go at a bull at a gate bringing this down and holding it and wondering why their teeth are all blue. So I hope that information helps. It only takes a little bit of practice and you can sharpen like a professional. Just take your time. There's enough other videos on the channel. If you're a beginner, there's a lot more. There's over 500 videos on my channel. So if you're looking for chainsaw sharpening, all you've got to do is in Google, it'll work really well in Google, put chainsaw users, doesn't matter whether it's one word or two words, and after that, just put sharpening or filing or chainsaw grinding. Use a couple of keywords and I'll guarantee it'll link it to other videos that I've got. So I hope that information helps. It's just interesting when I constantly see other videos out there. It says sharpen like a professional, and I know only too well that a lot of professionals don't sharpen their chains. They get someone else to do it because they're bloody busy chopping trees down and chopping other things up. And as I say, it's the last thing they do when they get home is want to bring out the file, go out in the garage and say to the missus, oh, I'll be out in the garage for the next couple of hours sharpening chains. No, doesn't happen that way. Anyway, look, I'm sure there's some professionals out there, arborists, that do sharpen theirs. But like anything else, most of the focus that the arborist is doing is cutting the tree down and cutting it up into small pieces. The sharpening is something that they leave for somebody else to do. Same as usually an arborist that chops a lot of trees down. Well, there'll be a gang. It could be 3 or 4 people. A guy will be operating the cherry picker. Probably the boss that owns the company's up there with the chainsaw, chopping the limbs down. These guys are so accurate the way that they can drop a tree and land within a couple of inches of where they want it to land. And that's what their expertise is, many, many years of chopping trees up. Not getting home using the chainsaw sharpener or the file. That's not what they do during the day. So yeah, just like to be a little bit clear when they say sharpen like a professional. And as I mentioned earlier before, some of the chainsaw shops don't do a very good job and grind half your chain away anyway. So yeah, you can do a better job just by taking your time. So if you are thinking of getting a chainsaw grinder, by all means, go and do it. It's not as difficult as what you think. Just take your time and think about what you're doing, and don't pull this grinding wheel down too fast. Just take your time and inspect what you're doing. One of the other little tips that I've got there, that when you put a chain on to be sharpened, have a look at the length of the teeth and start grinding the tooth that's approximately the average length. Don't start grinding your longest tooth or your shortest tooth. Start grinding and set up on the tooth that's roughly the average length. If when grinding that you've got a tooth that's a little bit short and it doesn't grind, mark it with a different colour texture. And the same with your tooth that's a little bit longer, because you're going to have to take more off that. Mark that with another texture and do those teeth when you finish sharpen the chain. So you may have 3 or 4 teeth that are a little bit odd size, too short, too long. Do them last, right? Before you swap over to the other side. And when you swap over to the other side, do the same thing. Look at the chain. Try and find the tooth that's roughly the average length. Mark that. Start doing that. If one tooth is a little bit short, skip that tooth and mark it. If one's a little bit too long, skip that. And eventually, you'll find out, if you sort of do it that way, you'll find out that your teeth will end up being uniform because you took the trouble and effort to sharpen those odd teeth. You can get damaged teeth, and when you do, you just dress the actual tooth that's damaged. They try and say, we're practical. Yes, you do try and keep the teeth approximately the same length. We're practical and we're possible. So it's not practical to keep them all the same length if it means that you've got to sharpen and take off 1.5 mil off every single tooth. That's certainly not practical, and that means that you're going to waste away over 10 or 15% of the life of the chain just to keep them the same length. If you use a progressive depth gauge rather than the standard constant depth gauge, you'll have no trouble irrespective of the length of the tooth, because the progressive depth gauge adjusts the depth of the raker based on the length of the tooth, whereas this type of flat gauge, constant flat gauge, will only keep the depth 0.65 of a millimetre. This is the type of gauge that you need. Progressive depth gauge made by Stihl. Also, you can get these at your Husqvarna dealer. And if you live over in America, West Coast Saws, they've got their own as well. Oregon don't make them. They've got a little flat gauge. It's really soft. Wouldn't recommend that to anyone. But certainly these gauges, they're hardened to a Rockwell hardness of 62. You can run the file. I've been running the file over that for the last 3 or 4 years. All is running the file over the top is only going to scratch it, because this plate is actually harder than the file. So you can't damage this gauge by running a file over it, and you won't damage this gauge by running a file over it. I hope that information helps. Strictly this is aimed at the homeowner, and turn you into a professional sharpener just with a little bit of trial and error and a little bit of effort. You too can become a professional sharpener using a file or a grinder just by taking your time and watching what you're doing. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.